So, right. Okay, good evening. And here we are looking at a verse from this week's Sedra Vayikra. And Vayikra is largely about korbanot, the offerings in the temple. And one second. Right. And one of the things about the offerings, it tells us, V'chol korban minchatcha, every offering that you bring, b'melech timlach, you should add salt to it. V'lo tashbit melach brit elokecha, you should not cease to have the salt of the covenant of your God. One second. The salt of your covenant of your God, me'al minchatecha, from your offering, al kol korbancha takriv melech. With every offering there should be salt. So in fact, every kind of offering has salt with it. One of the explanations of that, before we come into what the discourse says, is that the point of the offerings in the temple is a bond between existence, creation, and the divine. And existence is divided into four realms: the human, the animal, the vegetable, and the mineral. So the human being is the person bringing the offering. The animal, in the case of an animal offering, there is an animal which is being offered, a sheep, an ox, whatever it might be, a ram, and a goat, and that is the animal. The vegetable are the offerings brought, the libation, which might be oil or wine, or wine particularly, which is offered with the offering, brought with the offering. There might be a meal offering, that means an offering, like it says over here, with flour, that might also be brought. And then what about the mineral? The salt represents the mineral. So the salt is like the mineral dimension. So by having all those different aspects together, it represents the whole of existence, which is bonding with the divine when the offering is being brought. So that is I think it is Nachmanides who makes that comment, Ramban. The discourse is going to take it in a rather different way. And that's what we're going to be exploring now. It's a discourse that was said on Shabbat Vayikra, Pashat Zachor, as our Pasha is, our Sedra is this week, always the Sedra before Purim. And it was said in 1965. So we are now going to be looking at this discourse in a minute. And first of all, we will have the melody of the discourse. Right. Are people able to see the discourse? Okay. V'lo tashbit melach brit elokecha. You should not cease having the salt of the covenant with your God on the offerings. Now, the Rebbe is going to quote from the book of discourses, Likutei Torah, which takes this out of the context of the offerings in the temple and explains it in a completely different and much more general way relating closely to our lives today. So it explains in Likutei Torah, in this wonderful book of discourses by Rabbi Shneur Zalman, discourses of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, which were edited by his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, lived in the middle of the 19th century, around 1850, and his name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel, named after a great leader of Hasidism in the earlier generations of the movement, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. So here we have the names Menachem Mendel coming up in the Lubavitch, among the Lubavitch Rebbes and the Lubavitch community. So he explains there, Shahamelech mamteket et habasar. Salt sweetens the meat. The avsha melech atzmo ein botam. Even though the salt itself isn't tasty, right? People don't usually eat salt by itself. Aval pichein, nonetheless, hu poel hatam babasar. It causes more taste in the meat by the fact that the meat has been salted. It's a more tasty portion of meat. And it goes on to explain that similarly, there's a similar quality in Torah itself. Let me just get my little pointer. 1 second. Rather elusive. All right, I'll have to do without it. Okay. So there is this quality also in the Torah. And what is the salt in terms of Torah? That is the inwardness of Torah. Now we have the inner dimension of Torah, that means Chassidic teachings, like the teaching we're studying at this moment. And we also have the revealed dimension of the Torah, which usually is speaking about some halachic issue. Two people find a talit in the street, they find a valuable shawl in the street, and each one of them says, I found it, it's mine. And they have an argument about it, and they come to the judge, the Bet Din, or the rabbi, and the question is, how should the case be decided? Who does the talit belong to? So that's a very tangible, physical situation. And most of the Talmud, in the legal part of the Talmud, is talking about tangible situations of that kind. Whereas Pnimiyut HaTorah, the inner dimension of Torah, is speaking about revelation of the divine, concealment of the divine, different attributes, different worlds. It's talking about spiritual things that for the most part, people have no direct sensory contact with. They are concepts, they're ideas, and sometimes we can say that we can relate to those ideas. We're trying together, you and I, we're trying to relate to these teachings, but in themselves, they could be considered something shehi ba'atzma, which in itself, nistara v'ne'elama, is concealed and hidden. She'ena museget b'tchinat ta'am mamash. It can't be grasped in a kind of simplistic way. Kamo sheyesh lanu hasaga b'ta'am, contrasting with the way that we understand and we can grasp haniglot lanu, the aspect of Torah which is revealed to us. You talk about two people finding a Tali and having an argument about who found it first. Well, that's something that we can well understand, we can well imagine. A child can understand what's going on. Whereas if you talk about the attribute, the divine attribute, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and the world of emanation or the world of creation, one is immediately talking about spiritual realms, which I would say that the Rebbe or the Rebbeim, the Chabad Rebbeim, have taught us to appreciate these ideas. But that teaching hasn't necessarily reached everyone. I know someone, when he lived near where I live, we were quite close together. We were actually in university together. Very, very learned scholar, a great scholar. He knows the whole Tanakh, the whole Bible by heart, and probably large tracts of Talmud as well. But he couldn't study Chassidic teachings. He said it didn't make sense to him. But sometimes in Chassidic teachings, you have the word bechina. This is the bechina of that. A has the quality of B. He said he couldn't understand this word bechina. What does it mean? It has the quality of this. You know, either it's this or it's that. And unfortunately, he never entered the teachings of Chassidic thought. Great, great knowledge, very great, extensive knowledge. An expert on Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Bible. A brilliant man, but could not make the step into Chassidic teachings because it was concealed. It's nistara v'ne'elama, as far as he was concerned. It was hidden and concealed. So v'afal pichein, nonetheless. Now this is what the Rebbe is claiming, that the Chassidic teachings, the inwardness of the Torah, even though in themselves they are talking about concepts which are elusive, which are exalted, which are intangible, nonetheless they sweeten the meat. Now, what is the meat? The meat means the revealed part of the Torah. Because it is by studying the revealed part of the Torah, let's say the two people arguing who found the Talit first, or who found it at all. I'm saying I found it. And he says he found it. No, it's not true. I found it. And the other one says the same. Now, when a person at the same time, the same day, as well as learning the revealed part of Torah, he or she also studies the spiritual dimension of Torah, the Chassidic teachings. Through that specifically, the person comes to a fear of sin, an awe of God, a sense and awareness of the divine. When the fear of God is his treasure, then the Torah he's studying or she's studying is real spiritual Torah as a gateway to contact with the divine. Azai HaTorah hi Torat Hashem. Then the Torah becomes the Torah of God that the person is studying. He's not just studying for the excitement of his own clever mind, which is able to compare this that says this on that page and another thing on the other page, and therefore we can deduce this or that, and he has such a brilliant suggestion to make. But it's more than that. That is part of Torah study. That is part of Talmudic study, as the Tosafists teach us. But there's more than that. There's more than that. There's the awareness of the divine in the revealed part of the Torah, and that awareness of the divine is gained by studying the inner dimension of Torah. Now, that is the way it is in a Lubavitch yeshiva today. The Lubavitch yeshiva system was founded in 1897, and the system continues with Lubavitch yeshivot all over the world, including one in London here. And that is the idea that first in the morning one studies Chassidic teachings, and then one studies the revealed dimension of the Torah, one studies Talmud, Gemara, and then later in the evening again one studies Chassidic teachings. Now the fact of studying Chassidic teachings makes the prayer that the person prays deeper, more significant, a greater sense of contact with the divine. And it also makes the Talmud more significant, with a sense of contact with the divine through the teachings of the Talmud. Another aspect is that the Chassidic teaching becomes an interpretation of the Talmud. So it could be that, for example, the argument over the Talit, the two people who found the Talit, can be interpreted in a kind of mystical way, that this is really, for example, two people claiming with regard to a certain soul that they help that soul connect with the divine in a particular way. So in other words, the Talmud can be reinterpreted. It's to mean something altogether different, something spiritual. So that's another dimension of this. Okay, so is this something that everyone is on board with at this point? Now, okay, let's keep focused on the subject. So we're going back here to Ot Bet, section Bet. Now, here we have now the way this discourse in Likutei Torah, that means in this book with the discourses of the Tzemach Tzedek, of Rabbi Shneor Zalman, as a kind of introduction to explain the significance of studying the revealed Torah, the Talmud, Mavaed explains שהתורה היא חוכמתו יתברך, the Torah is the divine wisdom, שבאצילות, which is in the world of emanation, שבה מלובש אור אין סוף ברוך הוא ממש, in which is enclosed the radiance of the infinite itself. So the Torah is the wisdom of the divine, and in the world of Atzilut, the highest of the four worlds, and in the Torah is enclosed the radiance of the infinite. And then, now I mentioned before the Tzemach Tzedek, the grandson of Rebbe Shneor Zalman, he edited the discourses in Likutei Torah, and he wrote comments on them. So in brackets, in parentheses, he wrote, now that's why the Torah is called the ancient parable. Because the Torah expresses the supernal wisdom, Shuhu Kli, which is a vessel, L'or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, to the radiance of the infinite, may be blessed, Shuhu Kadmono Shel Olam, who is the ancient essence of the world, the originator of the world, the creator of the world, the one who came before the world, right? Kadmon l'chol davar. God is before the world, and that is so. Kadmono shel olam, the one who comes before the world means God. As it says about this in a discourse about Purim. Right, so there we have the concept of Purim being alluded to, and if we manage to get far enough in this discourse, we'll see more about it. So what the Tzemach Tzedek is saying is, because the Torah includes in it the radiance of the infinite, that's why it is called the let's call it the ancient parable, the parable which came before the world. But now we have to understand this, says the Rebbe. Because what is a parable? Dihine inyana mashal, a parable, kolel davar v'hipucho. It includes the thing and the opposite of the thing. The michad gisa, because on the one hand, harihu klila nimsha, the parable is a vehicle in order to understand what the parable is trying to get at. Let's give an example of a parable, a famous example in the Bible itself. There's the parable of when King David took Bathsheba and slept with her. And there was a whole thing about her husband, Uriah Hittite, right? We're not going into all the questions about David and Bathsheba. How could he do that? It's time does not permit that. I'm just taking one aspect of the story. The next thing is a prophet, Nathan, comes to the King David and tells him a parable. And it's a parable about a poor man who had one sheep, a female sheep, which he loved very much. And someone took away that sheep from the poor man, and the poor man's very upset. And then King David realizes the parable is about him taking away Bathsheba from her husband, Uriah the Hittite. So a parable is where you tell a person a story, and the story has a meaning, right? The parable has a meaning behind it. The meaning, the nimshal in Hebrew means the meaning of the parable. The meaning of the parable is enclosed in the parable. But on the other hand, it's not the parable itself. The parable is not the reality that it's talking about. Nathan could have come along and said, how dare you take the wife of this Uriah Hittite? But he didn't do that. He told him a whole story about a man who had a sheep. So there's a difference between the parable and the reality that the parable is talking about. V'yaterim is there, and there's a further problem, possibly. Shuhu ma'alim alanimsha. There could be that the parable conceals its own meaning. Imagine if David had not got the point, and he would have thought, oh, what a terrible thing. Let's give the man another sheep. And the prophet would have had to say to him, I'm not talking about sheep. I'm talking about Bathsheba, right? But it's quite possible for a person to hear a parable and not realize it's a parable. They think that's what you're talking about. V'chilashon Torah, as it says in Torah, which is another book of teachings by Rabbi Zalman, edited by the Tzemach Tzedek, and it's the discourse about Purim, which the Tzemach Tzedek mentioned. He didn't mention it by name, but he mentioned a discourse about Purim, and we can work out. People have worked out this is the discourse he means. She'eino mimahud hanimshol klal. The parable seemingly has nothing to do with its meaning. The parable is talking about something, it's talking about X, and the meaning is Y. Nathan, the prophet, is talking to David about a poor man who had a ewe and someone, a female sheep, and someone came along and took the sheep, and he's actually talking about a girl, a woman called Bathsheba. So that could be Shema'alim ala nimsha, that the parable hides the meaning. Now, of course, normally when people tell parables, the whole point of the parable is that you understand the meaning. But we're going to hear something very interesting and intriguing about the nature of Torah. Since this discourse in the teaching of Rabbi Shneur Zalman in Likutei Torah, it's talking about the greatness of Torah. Sheba melubash o ein sof baruch hu mamash, and that within the Torah is enclosed the radiance of the infinite. Ein muvan, what does it mean? Ma mosif b'zeh, what is he telling us extra? Shatorah nikhet mushal kadmoni. What is it telling? What extra point is he telling us that the Torah is called the ancient parable? Harei adoraba. On the contrary, in Yana Mashal Morea Lahelem Ala Nimshal. The idea of a parable indicates a concealment of the meaning. Kadmono shel olam, and the meaning is the ancient, the one who precedes the world, God who precedes the world, godliness. So what is the Tzemach Tzedek bringing this whole idea of the parallel into the discussion of the Torah? Now, the Yuvan, this will be understood. Right? This is getting a little bit complicated, but I hope it's going to become simple in a moment. The Yuvanim will understand this by considering the explanation. Of what we've mentioned before, the idea that the parable hides the meaning. You see, I think I need to explain to you now what the Rebbe means by the parable. I'm going to stop sharing. What the Rebbe means by the parable, and for that matter, the Tzemach Tzedek, the parable is the Talmud. The Talmud is talking about the halacha in the Talmud, the laws in the Talmud, the discussion of the law. The two people who found the Tali and they're arguing about it. The man who betrothed a certain woman and he can't remember which one it is, and there are 6 women there, and was it this one or that one? What do you have to do? And all the other kinds of questions and discussions that the Talmud has, they all relate to what you might call fairly straightforward, practical situations, which can be grasped easily in the mind. But what actually do they mean? And the point that the discourse is telling us is that within all the discussions of the Talmud and all the laws of the Talmud, there is a deeper spiritual dimension that we have to either be aware that there is a deeper spiritual dimension, and it may not immediately show itself what that dimension is, but just to be aware that there is another dimension to the whole discussion. And B, if we can, that we can find somehow what that actually means in terms of Chassidic spiritual discussion. What does it mean, this person who betrothed the woman and now he can't remember whether it's this one or that one? What do you have to do? Does he have to divorce both of them? Can they marry a Kohen after that, since a divorced woman can't marry a Kohen and maybe she wasn't really married to him? All kinds of questions of this kind. And the Talmud is thousands of such situations. So the awareness that there is a dimension beyond, and that's there within the teaching of the Talmud, and we are not aware of it. Many, many years ago, I was privileged to meet a very significant figure who lived in Jerusalem, and his name was Rabbi David the Nazirite, David Hanazir, David Cohen Hanazir. And he lived in Jerusalem, and it happened that I knew a person who was very close with him. And this figure took me to see this David Hanazir in his apartment, extraordinarily late at night, like around midnight. And when we came to his apartment, which was full of activity, we were told that David Hanazir, David the Nazirite, was asleep, which is not surprising at 12 o'clock at night, and Israelis get up very early in the morning. But when they saw my friend, who was like a significant figure, they said, well, we'll wake him up since you're here. He'll want to see you. So he got up indeed. He got up, an old man with long, long, long white hair. He was a Nazirite. And he began singing and dancing with my friend. And I was just watching this. I was a young man. It was an incredible sight. And I found out that this Reb David, he had many books, books of Kabbalah and books of Talmud. And the books of Kabbalah were on the open shelves, and the books of Talmud had a curtain behind them, covering them, because the books of Talmud, in his view, were so deep and so spiritual, they needed to be hidden by a curtain. So he reversed the way that most people think about it, and that is very much in tune with our discourse today. Now, so that's the issue, that the Talmud itself is the parable, and within the parable is the meaning, and the meaning might not be accessible, or we may not even be aware that there is a meaning. Now that's the problem. That is the problem that the discourse is talking about, that a person might study Talmud and not realize that there is a deeper meaning within it. So in order to explain this, the Rebbe is now going to talk about the difference between a parable and a riddle. I'm so sorry. Eleanor, thanks for your message. I hope you're okay now. Okay, so let's go back to the discourse and try to understand this. Rabbi Lou, do you have any comment to make at this point? Rabbi Lou, do you have any comment?
I'm just unmuting my mic. Do you hear me?
Yes.
No comment. Now, but I just want to mention what you're saying. Even in the parts of the Talmud or any other part of Torah, it's a fascinating point. In life, Talmud, that we understand the challenge, because there's a deeper meaning and purpose to them. Normally, you think of, when something happens, which is life throws you a curveball. Those are the things which are very there. At least one knows that there's a problem, there's a question, that there's a quest to find something. So it's saying here that everything in the Talmud, whether it's about when it's things in the Talmud which are very straightforward to understand, they really have a much deeper flavoring to them. As you're saying that, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Especially in view of what's going to come next about the Chida with the Mashal.
Right.
When people see something which they do understand, to appreciate that it's really much deeper than it appears on the surface. More significant.
Right, thank you. Now, Vayuvan, so this will be understood when we first consider what we said above. The parable can conceal the meaning. And in a certain way, that's an even greater concealment than the concealment in the case of a riddle. Because the riddle in itself, the riddle doesn't mean anything unless you translate the riddle into the point that it's trying to make. Or the riddle might be something illogical, like the riddle of Samson. Sheme'az yatsa matok. From the strong came the sweet. Right? Now, this was all part of Samson's involvement with the Philistines and fighting with the Philistines in different ways. And he killed a lion. And the lion, the carcass of the lion was lying there, and a swarm of bees or wasps made their nest there and produced honey. And so from the strong comes the sweet. Me'az, from the strong comes forth the sweet. So the only explanation of that riddle is that from the carcass of the lion, which is strong, due to the fact that there's a swarm of bees that have made a nest, have made a hive there, and they produced honey, that's the explanation of the riddle. It was a riddle that he gave the Philistines. And that riddle doesn't have any meaning except if you find the answer. What's the answer to the riddle? Like any riddle. Yes, people have riddles today. What's the answer to the riddle? And the answer is the explanation that makes sense. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense at all. Harimizah, from the fact that the riddle doesn't make sense by itself, without the answer, without the meaning. Harimizah gufa muvan. So from this we understand when we look at a riddle, shahachidam moral in yamasuyam shemitalemba. The riddle is talking about something or other that it's hiding and it's teasing us to find out what's the answer. Masha'en came by mashal, but a parable is different. Harigam lelo nimshal, even if you don't have the meaning of the parable, yeshva is a tochen, it's got a content. Like the story with King David, with Nathan the prophet, that there's a man, a poor man, and he has a ewe, he has one single sheep, a female sheep, and he loves the sheep very much, and someone came and took away the sheep. What a terrible thing. You can just think about sheep, and it's not really about sheep, but you might think that that's what it's about. And therefore it's possible that when a person hears the parable, a person might not grasp at all that there is some deeper meaning in that parable for him to grasp. Okay, I think we're going to miss out the brackets. Now, the inyan, now this concept that we've been talking about, the difference between the parable and the riddle, and the idea that the parable itself can be such a concealment that the person hears the parable and thinks that's the whole story. That relates to what it says in the Kutei Torah, the discourse of Rebbe Zalman. Hachiluk, the difference shebein esek haTorah nigle, between studying the revealed Torah, i.e., limud hilchot haTorah, learning the laws of the Torah. Shahadam halomed, that the person learning masig v'tofes, he can grasp mahut v'atzmiut hachochma sheba'alacha. He can grasp seemingly the very essence of the wisdom, the idea which is in the law. Two people have found a talit, and the beddin have a particular way of working out how to deal with this situation, so that can be understood. Because it's talking about physical things. And physical things, we can understand physical things. And that contrasts lilimud chokhmat Kabbalah, with learning Kabbalah, mysticism, including Chassidic teachings. V'al derech zen, similarly, limud ha'agadot v'sipurei Torah, learning the stories in the Torah. You see, in the Torah itself, in the Bible, Tanakh, the Pentateuch, a lot of the Torah is stories, and there are also laws. Now, the question can be, what does the story teach us? Jacob wrestles with an angel. What is the story actually telling us? How do we respond? Does that have anything to do with us? Jacob's wrestling with an angel. Or it might be in the Talmud. In the Talmud, you can learn a certain section of Talmud which is telling you laws and the discussion of those laws, and then suddenly it can go into a story. And what is the meaning of that story? So, Shehilchot HaTorah, the laws of the Torah, Shemalu b'Hashem b'Seichel, which are enclosed in the intellect of man, Heim dugmat mashalim, they are like the parables. Ki mitzad hitlapshut b'Seichel, because they are enclosed in the rational mind of a person. That's the problem. Efshar litot chas v'shalom, God forbid, very strong language, God forbid it's possible to make a mistake, she'ein bahem rak hachitzoniyut, that the only thing about them is the external dimension, gufei Torah, the body of the Torah. V'chilashon hazohar. Now the Zohar tells us, chashivuta de gufa de nishmata. The significance of the body of the Torah is, or anybody, is the soul. What makes the body alive? It's the soul within the body. Kahai Gavna, and similarly in the case of Oraita, in the case of the Torah, Itla Gufa, the Torah has a body and it's got a soul. The body of the Torah, Gufei Torah, are the laws of the Torah, the body of the Torah. Nishmata, and the soul of the Torah, which is the spiritual dimension, the spiritual dimension is the real source of the Torah as a whole. So therefore, the person might think, he might stop at the body of the Torah. He learns the laws of the Torah, very nice, now he knows the law, without realizing that there is a beyond. There's always a beyond in that thing that he studied. But in the case of stories which are told, let's say in the Talmud, there are many stories and explanations of verses, things about the patriarchs and about other figures, Moses and so on, and also about the rabbis themselves, many stories about the rabbis, the lives of the rabbis, the behavior of the rabbis. Since these stories haven't been involved with direct instructions, it's just a story about something. What is that telling us to do? Like, for example, there's a story about Moses on Mount Sinai. He saw all the future teachers of the Torah, and among them he saw Rabbi Akiva, and Moses came and joined Rabbi Akiva's class, and he was listening to what Rabbi Akiva said. It's a beautiful story in Talmud Menachot, in the tractate Menachot. But what does it mean to me, right? So we don't see clearly what is the instruction. One sees in the story that they are hinting to the esoteric dimension of the Torah, dugmat achida, like a riddle, but we can't necessarily tell what it actually means. But we're aware that it's got a higher meaning. It's something spiritual. Whereas the other side of the Torah, studying the Talmud, the laws about two people finding a Tali, one might simply stop there and think that it's not talking about anything other than a talit, as if King David, hearing Nathan the prophet, said, well, that's a terrible thing about sheep. We'll have to try and get a sheep for that poor man and find out how much it costs to get a sheep. He's taking the parable literally, and he's not, of course he didn't do this, but he's not realizing what the parable really means. The Yesh Lomar, and the Rebbe suggested, this is what the Tzemach Tzedek meant, But Masha Katav, by the fact that he wrote his comment that he wrote on the discourse of his grandfather, and he wrote it in the Likutei Torah, which he was editing, and it was being printed. That's why the Torah is called the ancient parable. Because the Torah is the vessel for the radiance of the infinite. In other words, he's indicating that the concealment of the parable, we have to change it. And to have the effect, that instead of it being a blank text, a story, a situation or law, it has to become a vessel. That through the learning of the Chassidic dimension of Torah, shenikret melach, which is called salt, going back to the beginning of the discourse, hinegama mashal, the parable, nigle the Torah, and the parable means the revealed dimension of Torah, nase kli la'en sof baruch hu, becomes the vessel for the radiance of the infinite. Now that's really the theme of the discourse. And I don't know how much we're going to actually get through the discourse, but that is the theme, the way in which, by revealing the radiance of the infinite, by being aware that there is the radiance of the infinite ready, as it were, to be revealed in this parable. And it might not only be the parable of the Talmud, it might be the parable of life. And by realizing that there is the radiance of the infinite ready to be revealed in the parable of life and the parable of the Talmud, that's the way we have contact with the divine, the infinite divine. All right, now I want to check that people are with me and understand what's going on and field any questions.
Actually, you're saying that there are only mashals, really, because the rituals are mashal, the Torah is a mashal, the Talmud's a mashal, the Zohar is definitely a mashal, nature, teva, right, Elohim is definitely a mashal, life is a mashal, so we're working only with mashals.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of putting it, and I'd like to add something, Eve. There's a teaching of the Mittler Rebbe, the second Loewenthal Rebbe, which talks about the nature of a map. Now, we are conscious of a map, so imagine we have a paper map. Yeah, forget about the map on your phone for the moment. We've got a nice paper map of, the United States or Britain or Israel or wherever. And on the map, there are blue lines which represent rivers. And there are brown masses which represent hills. And there are black lines which represent roads. And then there's some kind of symbol that represents houses, it's a city. And there's a big blue patch which represents a lake or the sea. So we know that the map is a mashal, so to speak. It's a parable. It's the symbols on the map indicate some kind of reality. So now you take your map and you go into the garden or the street, and you look at it. Yes, this line is this street. The hill over there, we can see it on the map in this brown mass. The lake over there, we can see that in this blue patch. So we can translate the map into the reality. Now, so the Mittler Rebbe then says, you know what? That reality is also a map. It's a map for a higher realm. The lake that we can see, the street that we can see, the mountain that we can see, are all symbols for a higher level of reality. Wonderful. So we move from our physical world to a spiritual realm, understanding that the symbols, the that with the manifestations which are here in our physical world are really only symbols for something on a spiritual level. Having ascended to that spiritual level, says the Mittler Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, consider that on that spiritual level too, what is there is a map for that which is higher. So in other words, everything is going higher and higher and higher without end because God is infinite.
And that's how you climb.
Yes. Well, if climbing is what we need to do, I mean, one aspect of life is to understand what our role is. And it might be not so much that we climb up to the highest level, but that we use the input from all these levels into making us real people here on this level.
I don't know what that means. What are real people?
There was a novel that someone wrote, and she came in contact with a famous Lubavitch Chassid called Rabbi Avram Mayor. This happened around the 1980s, I think, something like that, or 70s perhaps. And he was in the same house where she was staying, and she later wrote a novel about her life, and it included this scene. And she was studying music. And he was sitting in the room where she was pretending to read, and he was praying the morning prayer, wrapped up in a talit and tefillin, not taking any notice of her, and just praying in a very melodic way. Since she was a music scholar, this strongly attracted her. The deep baritone of his singing the words of the prayer. And he would stop and reflect on the words, and then he would start again. And she's pretending to read a book, and she's actually listening very intently and writing a very beautiful description. And then he came to the Shema. And the way in which he said the Shema, I can't remember how she described it physically, but the impression it gave her, which she wrote, which I do remember, is he knows who he is. He knows who he is. I thought that was very meaningful. He's not under any illusions about himself, but he knows who he is in relation to the whole infinite structure of existence. So does that make more sense?
It does. I guess what I was sort of kicking against a bit. I mean, that was beautiful, and I'm glad you said that. And it's helpful because I mean, you've got to rise in order to bring down. Baruch, right? You're supposed to bring down, but you've got to go up to bring it down.
Yes, that's true. But the going up has to be with the intention of bringing it down, because otherwise the person might try to go up and up and up and somehow get lost at a higher level. Yeah,
like Aaron's sons who got burnt and all the rest of it.
Yes.
No, I understand. But I mean, you've got to, I mean, it was never very clear to me. Sometimes, you just find you're up and you don't know how you got there. But this is interesting because this is the first time I've heard anyone explain maybe how you would intentionally climb.
Anyone explain how what?
How you might intentionally set about climbing as opposed to having it as a gift.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
May I add something?
Yes, Sophia.
I was going to ask this anyway, but then I want to add it a little bit on from what Eve was saying. I was wondering if you could expand on the idea of salting the food. I mean, the parallel that I was getting from that is salt being salt of the earth, and then salting your food is to sort of to humble you and bring you back down to earth, and salt comes from the earth, and man, human beings come from the earth, and then your conversation with Eve just also made me realize that it's bringing stuff from high in order to bring it lower. Well, surely that's also a symbol of salt. It's bringing things back to the low, and of course the food that we eat, because we don't have a temple, in some ways can represent a sacrifice. So then it's quite high.
I think I would say don't get lost in the parable.
Very true. Very true.
It's taking the salting of the sacrifices as a parable to indicate to us the relationship between two aspects of Torah. Now, of the hidden dimension, the Chassidic dimension, and the revealed dimension. One represents the salt, the other represents the meat. But I wouldn't, obviously one can expand on the parable and might find all kinds of interesting things. But I would say let's try and understand the meaning that he's trying to explain through the parable. It's like, as if King David says to Nathan the prophet, now tell me about this ewe, how much did it weigh? What kind of ewe was it? There's different strains of sheep, which one was it? That's getting lost in the parable.
You have to learn when to take things with a pinch of salt.
Okay. So let's see how we can now what this next section is talking about is that at the beginning of this passage in the book Likutei Torah, it's talking about self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice comes from the essence of the soul. And that's something which is very profound, something higher than intellect. And the idea of self-sacrifice, our Rebbe is explaining, that links to the whole idea of seeing the godliness which is in the parable. That in the Torah, there is the radiance of the divine, the radiance of the infinite, and that links with the fact that the person is able to live in a framework, in a movement of potential or actual self-sacrifice for the divine. If we imagine people who are, let's say now in the Ukraine, yes, desperately trying to protect their children, let's say, or protect the Torah scroll. I heard a very moving story just today about a family living here in London, and the father of the family, I think he was a boy, on Kristallnacht in Germany. And he was in a certain town, I don't know which one, and he could see the synagogue has been set alight. He ran home, took off his yarmulke, took off his sort of Jewish-looking clothes, and ran back to the scene looking like a non-Jew. He then ran into the burning synagogue through the fire escape, climbed up the fire escape, and ran into the burning synagogue. And he went to the ark and took out, which hadn't yet burst into flames, but it was going to. He took out a Torah and he ran out with the Torah and ran back to home. And he actually survived the war, and his family still has that Torah scroll that he managed to save. So he was risking his life for that Torah scroll. And a person can live in such a way that they are, in spiritual terms, when a person behaves in that kind of way, it's something flowing through from the very essence of the person to every aspect of their activities. Yes, it was beyond intellect. You know, if someone would say, exactly what are you doing? Why are you running into this burning synagogue? Are you crazy? Let's hide in your home. You know, try and save your own life. But no, he had to try to save a Torah scroll, and he did. Now, the Rebbe explains that this is what the Tzemach Tzedek is hinting at when he writes the reference, as it writes about this in a discourse about Purim. Now, he doesn't write about the name of the discourse, but we've been able to work out that's it's sort of understood which discourse he means. Now, what is Purim all about? All right, we can look at Purim in several different ways. Let's see how this discourse presents Purim. Ika inyan Purim, the main idea of Purim, hu achiyuv lebesumi ad lo yoda, is the duty. The normal way of translating this would be to get drunk till one doesn't know. Right now, that's the way that's something many people take very literally. And they imbibe a lot of whiskey and vodka and other alcoholic beverages, and they get drunk. I'm not sure how much that is the case. You know, it depends which part of London you're in. And the Talmud tells some interesting stories about people getting very drunk on Purim. So we have this concept of getting very drunk, and of course, or not of course, but as it happens, this is going to be interpreted in a particular way. And what we're going to come to, you see, ad lo yoda. Now, what it is that one doesn't know, as let's just follow the way the Rebbe explains it. This is the only mitzvah which applies every single minute of the day on Purim. Unlike there are other mitzvahs on Purim. One mitzvah on Purim, a very important one, is to hear the Megillah. We have to hear it twice, once in the evening and once in the daytime, depending on, you know, whether we're able to do that, depending where one lives and so on. But if one is able to hear the Megillah twice, once in the evening, once in the daytime, that's wonderful. Another mitzvah that one can only do in the daytime is giving a gift of food, 2 pieces of food to another Jewish person. You take 2 kinds of food, it could be an orange and a can of Coca-Cola, and you give it to another person, you fulfill the mitzvah of Mishloach Manot. Another mitzvah is to give charity to 2 different people needing, or 2 different funds needing charity. So one gives charity, and that's another mitzvah. Now, the Rebbe is saying here, a further dimension of Purim is getting drunk, or in some sense getting drunk. One might understand this in very non-literal terms, until one doesn't know the difference between Aru Haman, cursed is Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, blessed is Mordechai. In other words, cursed is Haman means that's talking about the negative realm, which is cursed. And blessed is Mordechai means the positive realm, which is blessed. And one gets so drunk that one can't see the difference between them. Now, one of the ways this is explained halachically, in fact, the words cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai have the same numerical value. I'm not going to go through it now, but they have the same numerical value. And so if one gets so drunk, so tipsy, let's say, that we can't work out the numerical values of these 4 words and see that these 2 words, cursed is Haman, have the same numerical value as the other 2 words, blessed is Mordechai, one's fulfilled this requirement of getting so drunk one doesn't know the difference between the negative and the positive. The way the discourse is going to explain it, and we may not get to the end of the discourse, so I want to make it clear now, is that the negative dimension is the negative dimension of life. And the positive is the positive dimension of life. But if we reach the level beyond knowledge, ad lo yoda, beyond knowing, we're reaching a sort of a contact with the infinite, which goes beyond the positive and the negative. We're reaching higher than the positive and the negative. And then we don't see the difference between the positive and the negative, because when we look at the negative, we see that it's really positive. So the fact that the person is able to ascend to this higher level of consciousness enables them to see the negative aspects of life in a positive light, that somehow or other they are positive. And so that's what it means, this process of going to this higher level. And so in a sense, if we read back into what we had in the discourse up to now, it's as if life is a parable. And then we have some problematic issue which is taking place, and the person might find themselves in the middle of a very negative aspect of the parable, God forbid. But then they're able to elevate their consciousness in some way, let's say through the study of Chassidic teachings, or through the power of self-sacrifice within them, that the whole thing is transformed. That man, in other words, applying that to the story that I just told, which I heard just today. The man who saved the boy, I imagine he was a teenager, the boy who saved the Torah scroll, by doing that, changed his perception of what was taking place around him. Of course, it was all terror and horror, and it could well be his parents were killed and everything. He then became a Kindertransport child. He was sent on the Kindertransport. That's how he survived, and he came to London, and it's his child, who is his son, who is telling that over to the person who told it to me. A very remarkable story. So the fact that he carries out this act of self-sacrifice for the Torah scroll, in a sense, changes his relationship with his surroundings. It's as if he is seeing through the parable. Now, it could be if we talked to him and we said, how did you, I doubt that he's alive anymore, unfortunately. If we talked to him, we said, what were your feelings later? It might contradict what I'm saying. But from the point of view of Chassidic teaching, an act of self-sacrifice has a transformative power. If we consider more recently the Jews who lived in Russia before Glasnost, there were some very religious Jews there who were extremely careful about every detail of Jewish law in the most incredible way, and very moving. I remember a time when the Rebbe quoted one of the questions that they had asked him, and the Rebbe wept with the depth of the sensitivity of the question they were asking. That it came from a deep yearning for observance of Judaism, and they were in a tremendously difficult situation. A person who is in that mood, that process, that framework of self-sacrifice, there is a sense in which their perception of reality is a different perception. So the discourse then talks about the idea. All right, so now we're coming back to the way the discourse presents this concept. But I think we've actually covered the central theme of the discourse, that it's the parable of negativity, which is the negativity of the situation in the Purim story or in life. We see through the parable, we see the deeper meaning within, which is godliness and contact with the divine, and we're aided in that through the power of self-sacrifice. Another dimension to that is the power of repentance, that the repentant person struggles with their perception of their own life and sees the negativity of the way they have been living, and they want to try to live in a better way, more in accordance with the Torah. And this can carry them higher in certain ways than the person who's never sinned. And the discourse gives two aspects to that. One of them is that the world does have different dimensions of negativity, lower and lower and lower. And the righteous person is not allowed to touch those dimensions because they're forbidden. When the Torah says a certain kind of food or a certain kind of behavior is forbidden, it means that that is something on a lower level, and it's on such a low level, it's a level of impurity, something like that, and the person therefore cannot entangle with it at all. But a person who is not religious, he does entangle with that negative level. He eats the non-kosher food. He does the forbidden action. And because of that, he is tangled up with the lower level of the impure forces. And now the klippah. And now when he or she repents, they are elevating everything to a higher spiritual level, and they're revealing in the forbidden action, they're revealing godliness. So that's one way in which the repentant person is higher than the person who is righteous. And the other way, the Rebbe says in this discourse, which I'd never noticed before, the Rebbe put it in, or Chassidic text putting it in quite this way, the righteous person is quite self-satisfied, says the Rebbe in this discourse. He's self-satisfied because he's always doing the right thing. So he's very pleased. He davened very nicely. He learned very nicely. He gave charity very nicely. He did everything very nicely. He goes to bed. He says, thank God I managed to live a very meaningful and positive day. He's happy. And happiness can be understood as complacent. And the person who looks at his life and sees it full of holes, it's negative, he's done this, he's done that, he's in this bad situation, that bad situation. And he says, how terrible I am. He is not complacent. He feels very uncomfortable, and he is yearning to be closer to the divine. So the Rebbe presents the view that the yearning to be closer to the divine is greater than being close to the divine. Yes, the righteous person is close to the divine, but he feels very good about it. And the person who's further away and who's yearning, that is something more precious. So that's the two ways in which repentance is another example of this process, where the parable, you see the meaning in the parable, and through that, the parable is transformed, and you realize what the whole story is really about. And what is the whole story about? It's about God. And repentance is about God, is connecting to God. And negative things happening is about God, and we connect to God. And the Torah is about God. And even when it's talking about two people finding a talit and having an argument, who found it first, that's also about God. So it's all about God. I think what's happened is that I've basically given a kind of a summary as I try to understand it, this beautiful, beautiful discourse, and hopefully we've shared it together. There are a lot more pages to go through. We have only reached page 8, and we went from 5, 6, 7, 8, and it actually goes up to page 14, so we're not going to be able to do it together, but I have tried to give you a summary of it. So thank you very much.